Since its inception, the Federal Reserve has drifted far from its original mandate. In this video, we're going to examine this more closely. So what was the Federal Reserve actually created for?
This is outrageous, locking the doors on their customers.
I had my life savings in there. Or maybe they're not in there anymore. I heard they plumb run out of cash.
What have they done with our money? I don't understand.
In my opinion, those bankers are rascals. I don't trust them anymore to keep my money safe.
When first established, the Fed was simply meant as a lender of last resort. There were no monetary policy objectives because the Fed was not intended to conduct monetary policy. They started trying to actively manage the money supply in the 1920s and more so in the 1930s when we went off the gold standard. Alexander Salter writes for AIER, the Fed was supposed to stop panics by preventing a run on banks from evolving into a run on the banking system. As a lender of last resort, the Fed could help solvent but illiquid banks to come up with the requisite liquidity to meet obligations. Unfortunately, the Fed was derelict in its duty. Fed leadership never behaved as a responsible lender of last resort. The Fed let too many solvent banks fail during the Great Depression and has helped too many insolvent banks stay afloat ever since. With the suspension of the dollar's redeemability for gold in 1934 domestically and 1971 internationally, the Fed's mission was expanded to include control over monetary policy. It has not handled this responsibility very well either. Inflation has been higher, and the future purchasing power of money has been harder to predict under the Fed. In the 1930s and 1940s, the Fed was treated as a part of the Treasury and actively monetized the debts of the New Deal and World War II.
$3,500,000 home of the Federal Reserve, founded in the Wilson administration, is opened in Washington.
I dedicate this building today to progress.
The American people showed that they still have confidence that the president's economic plan is indeed working.
There's no evidence that I can see that over this vast period of time that the Federal Reserve has existed, that things on the whole have been better. The great post-World War II inflation was fed by the Federal Reserve doing exactly what they're planning to do now, namely buying up the bonds issued by the Treasury.
In 1977, it was officially assigned the dual mandate as objectives for monetary policy.
And so we typically call this the dual mandate. That is two goals. One of them is low inflation and the other is low unemployment. And so the goals as assigned by Congress are typically referred to as the dual mandate. But you'll notice there's a couple words that are missing from that. It doesn't say anything about equality. It doesn't say anything about diversity or inclusion. And yet, the Fed has started to pursue those goals anyway without instruction from Congress.
In August 2020, it reinterpreted its objectives and took a more activist approach to managing rather than just supporting the economy. Paul Kupiec sums it up here. Given the Fed's recent performance, a case could be made for revisiting the Fed's congressionally mandated responsibilities or proposing changes in the way the FOMC conducts monetary policy. But instead of probing the causes and possible remedies for the Fed's recent disappointing performance, the administration and House Democrats are crafting executive orders, passing bills, and proposing new legislation that will remake the Fed by expanding its mandates to include Great Reset, climate change, and stakeholder capitalism agendas. With the Fed unable to deliver on its primary goals successfully, why would responsible public officials force it to take on new politically charged missions like controlling greenhouse gas emissions, promoting equal employment, income, wealth, and affordable credit outcomes across racial and ethnic groups, and issuing a new central bank digital currency? This question is especially important because these new mandates would almost certainly fuel inflation and permanently depress economic growth.
The Fed has actually joined an international group of central banks that one of their stated goals is to promote green energy and move away from fossil fuels. And so even though the Fed is saying that they're not doing that, they've committed themselves to doing that by joining this group.
So from the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, which tasked the Fed to provide elastic currency, to controlling monetary policy with its dual mandate of inflation and employment, the Fed now drifts even further into the territory of politicized goals like diversity, equity, inclusion, climate change, wealth and income inequality, and CBDC. So lately you might have said that the Fed has done a less than stellar job with monetary policy, placing the pursuit of woke goals above its dual mandate. Thomas Hogan argues that the Fed allowed inflation to go unfettered in part because it didn't want to cause unemployment for minorities, all the while harming the very people they purportedly aim to help.
He knew that whole time that they were pushing the economy beyond what would be considered stable in order to try to achieve this goal of maximum employment. And so obviously that causes a number of problems. One being, high inflation already is bad for regular people. I'm amazed by how many people in the press and how many economists are willing to just kind of ignore the problem of inflation. They're so focused on the unemployment rate that they don't realize how badly inflation harms average Americans.
If they've now included DEI and climate policy and other things into their drifting mandate, they can't maybe do that much about it directly right now. Like they can indirectly influence those things perhaps, maybe directly for the climate stuff, maybe indirectly for the DEI. But if there was a CBDC, would they be able to directly influence all of those objectives?
Absolutely. So the central bank digital currency is something that they are talking about doing. And there are a number of other countries that are working on this as well. China has specifically adopted one, and that's what they use it for, is they track the transactions of everyone in China, and they use that to monitor what people are doing so that they can reward people that are doing things that the government likes and penalize people who are doing things the government does not like.
Okay.
As a critic of the regime, she's often been under house arrest. But now the government has developed a new restriction on movement. The Corona Warning app is compulsory nationwide, but no longer works for her. Wang Yu can't even go shopping. When she needs to go to court for a sensitive case, the app shows a yellow code, even after multiple negative PCR tests.
It is the financial provisions of this Emergencies Act that are particularly concerning to many. The federal government is saying banks have already started to freeze the accounts of people involved in the protests, and they are warning there will be dire financial consequences to come.
Major credit card companies are going to start using a new code to keep track of sales at gun stores.
Where are they traveling? How are they traveling? What are they eating? What are they consuming on the platform? So, individual carbon footprint tracker.
And where does that action need to begin? We've talked a lot about the richer nations having a responsibility here, right? Especially when it comes to reparations.
And so the Fed, if they introduced a digital currency that people would start using, they could track everyone's transaction, and the Fed says that they wouldn't, they say that they wouldn't be using that for bad purposes, but, obviously they would have the ability to. And when the government collects information about people, we have seen in the past that they use it for bad purposes. And so some of this information would be shared with other parts of the government, potentially with law enforcement, potentially with the IRS, and some of it might be used by the Fed to reward activities that they politically like and, punish activities that they politically don't like. I mean, they would literally have the ability to either block transactions of things that they don't want you to buy, or just take money out of your bank account and give it to people with other bank accounts. And so this is a pretty dangerous situation, because that's actually something that some politicians want them to do already.
So if the Fed continues on its current trajectory, where do you think that will end up? Do you think we'll end up looking something like China or maybe something else?
I wrote an article joking that this was like the time when the state of Indiana tried to assign the value of pi to be 3.14. Like they were going to make that the law that pi was, pi is an irrational number that goes on forever. And no matter what Congress says, they can never change the physical laws of the universe in this way, right? And that's basically what's happening here when you assign the Fed or any other government agency to do some kind of impossible task, it's not going to end well. And so trying to give them this goal of, managing inequality, or even more substantially as some of these new proposals would be to eliminate inequality in wealth or income, that's just crazy. It's not something the Fed could possibly do. It's an impossible goal that is only going to have terrible, terrible consequences for the economy and be absolutely terrible for, the American people.
The Fed is really drifting. more than I thought. What can be done about this?
So I want us to do exactly the opposite of what a lot of these bills are saying and simplify the Fed's goals. I think instead of having a dual mandate, the Fed should have one goal. So 2 goals is already too many because it gives them this sort of like get out of jail free card that they can always shift. When inflation is high, they can say, oh, we were just worried about unemployment this time. Or if unemployment is high, we were worried about inflation, right? And so if you have 2 goals, you don't really have one. Right? You've got nothing because you can just change your story all the time. And so I think the Fed should be assigned one specific goal by Congress. And then there's the question of what is that goal? But I would say that the question of what is less important. The important part is having the Fed have one goal and be responsible and letting Americans know what that is.
So here's a really nice quote from Thomas Sowell. Many on the political left are so entranced by the beauty of their vision that they cannot see the ugly reality they are creating in the real world.
There's no, the Fed represented wonderful hopes, but we've had so many programs that represented wonderful hopes that ended in disaster.
So, but what would you replace it with? How would the currency? How would the currency run?
We would replace it. We could replace it with what existed when it was created,
which was the gold standard.
Well, it may be the gold standard, but maybe not. But there's no evidence that what would you replace it things always bother me.
They do?
When someone removes the cancer, what do you replace it with?
To sum it up, the Fed has drifted significantly from its origins and is now even meddling in woke activist missions. So what do you think? Do you think the Fed will be reformed and change its ways? Do you think that there's any possibility that they would accept any kind of reform? Or do you think that the Fed is already too far gone and there's no possibility of any kinds of changes? Let us know in the comments below.